There, Buttercups. Your resident Teabelle here. Welcome to Hark, 'tis the Teabelle. Let's dive in for that tea today, huh? Buttercups, we know that Savannah, our beloved Savannah, Georgia, is extremely haunted. And most of these houses have evidenced history to show us why they're haunted. But today's house is one of those good tall tales that you just have to have from time to time. So let's get on with 12 West Oglethorpe and its tall, dark tales. Just so y'all are aware, I am throwing out a trigger warning in this episode. At this point, there will be talk of personal unaliving, which we don't get a lot of in the prior episodes. Please be careful and choose to watch at a safer time, or if this really is a thing for you and you cannot watch it, I will not feel bad in one bit if you have to pass up this episode. But that being that, please note there is talk of personal unaliving in this episode. So prior to this house, which was thought to be built around the turn of the 20th century, there was another home built on the site. This house was accompanied by the Gordon family of Savannah for at least 15 years. One of those Gordons was our beloved Juliet Gordon Lowe. But she was younger when she lived there, right? This newer house, though, was built as a private residence. And this lasted a short time, as it was soon sold to the Savannah Charter of the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks. Y'all, this house holds a dark and twisted history. And there are several tales of woe that really do incorporate and encase this house. And we're going to go with each one of them today because I think that it's an interesting turn of events. It is said that the home that once stood in this lot was owned by a doctor. Well, this doctor was very busy during the yellow fever epidemic, and it was his family's home. This devastating yellow fever epidemic would be equivalent to a modern day biblical plague, guys. The population of both city and state, it was experiencing a massive decrease due to just this alone. It was only a matter of time before this doctor, who was literally in the middle of this epidemic trying to help people, heal people, and all that good stuff, would catch it himself. And unfortunately, 'tis common knowledge, if your family gets sick, you are getting sick. Typically, correct? I know all the moms out there know what I mean when I say that if a kid gets sick, you're getting sick. Now, late one night, after a very long, tireless, and extremely weary day, he had called it quits and went home to his safe space. Or so he thought. Now remember, Savannah was more like a war zone with this unforgivable disease. So going home to what he considered his safe space should have been relaxing. Well, that was the night he faced his mortality. There was something inside of him. It halted him at the front door. This nagging feeling washed over him, and it really made him truly question going inside of his home. But he wiped it away. This was a safe space. What was the big deal? Nothing had happened thus far. So he collects himself, and he just tries to shake this feeling off. But as he enters his home and takes a step inside the house, he's realizing that with every step, something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. And y'all, this is when the enemy descended upon his home. Although, let's be fair, it descended upon his home prior to that. This is when the enemy made themselves known. He learned that his youngest child had a high fever, and his organs seemed to be shutting themselves down. He tried valiantly to save his child, but he could not help his child. This child became yellow, while everything he regurgitated was black as tar. And the poor thing fell into a coma, which right at this point seems like a bittersweet blessing, because at least They're not feeling the pain, but we know where this is going to end, unfortunately. Well, this child passed later in the night, and this poor doctor, this was only the start of his own personal hell. He was a practiced, well-known doctor, but yet he could not save his own child. Now this enemy, yellow fever, conquered each remaining family member, one by one, in their own torturous way. And he continued to work tirelessly to save each one, only feeling defeated with each death that he encountered. At this point, he was the only person left in his family. And with that, he lost any sense of reality he had. And can anybody blame him? He had witnessed horrors beyond one's imagination, and he had begun to blame himself. He must have been the one to bring this enemy, to allow this enemy into his home. Therefore, he had to have been the cause of his family's demise. And at this point, he believed himself to be a mass murderer. He hadn't taken them someplace safe outside the epidemic, i.e. out of Savannah and out of Georgia. He just left them in the middle of the war zone. And he had convinced himself quite well that it was his vanity. He had been vain by putting his family in harm's way. Now, at this point, with all this guilt, which is probably survivor's guilt now, he wanted the infection for himself. He wanted to feel everything he felt, that his family felt, because that was the only way to make things even. But he never got it. He wanted his turn. He reasoned he was the cause of his family's torture, so he wanted to be punished. He wanted to be punished not just for infecting them or for failing to save them, but for surviving. Now, at some point, I'm sure he had lost whatever sense of reality he had, and he was just so far into the grief that he made a final decision that he couldn't take back, and he wanted to join his family. But he didn't know how. He couldn't take the easy route with a bullet in the head. He decided he had found a solution. He entered the room of his youngest child, which was empty but for a bed. He boarded up the window as he felt undeserving of even the light, and locked himself in that room with neither food nor water. He sat on that hardwood floor, wasting away. But in truth, it wouldn't take much. He was already weak from the battle he fought from losing his family. His body was malnourished, and it was already dying. It didn't take long, though, for him to pass in the dark room of his youngest child on the hardwood. Unfortunately, at this point, whether this is a true said story or this is just a tall tale, it unfortunately makes sense, especially that he probably was experiencing survivor's guilt. And at this point, how does one handle it? And there may not have been anybody for this man to talk to, especially back in that time. Perhaps it was just taboo for a man to have emotions like this or to feel anything but brave. One wonders, were men trained to be strong and tough and to never show their emotions? Especially then. Of that we will not be certain. But what we can be certain of is that this tale is true. It is a very dire one indeed. The rumor mill was on fire with this one. They heard the whispers that this was a church. Not just any church, y'all. Not just a nice old Catholic or Baptist church or anything like that. It was a church of Satan. You heard me correctly. I'm going to repeat this for you so you can hear it again. They were talking that this was a church of Satan. Essentially where they had practices and rituals and animal sacrifices. It ran like wildfire. Those details were probably on everybody's lips. Crazy enough, that would give this house a lot more credibility to its hauntedness if that were true. So let's throw aside the fact that the legend of the doctor and his family during the yellow fever epidemic and Satanists to another tale of woe. It was to include a young couple with a baby. They were warned by family and friends. They were warned of everything that had happened in the house, the legends, everything. And they ignored every single red flag. They must have had rose-colored glasses on when they looked at this house. Everybody thought this house was cursed, and that couple disagreed. They thought this was their home, they were going to be in there for a while, and they were just happy moving in. Well, their baby, who was seemingly healthy prior to moving in, was no longer healthy. They thought that the baby had developed jaundice, but the baby's fever and the yellowing skin wouldn't go away. The symptoms only intensified quickly. And it took one evening to realize that the baby could not fight this illness any longer, and its body gave way. Now, this poor mother, she blamed herself. She started to believe that the rumors of this house being cursed were true. It was crazy because her baby hadn't had a single mark to its body prior to moving in. And much like that doctor, she became overcome with grief, and she just lost the will to live. And so it's said that the woman returned to her house late one night. She was by herself. Her husband had no idea where she was. Her whole family was concerned about her, understandably so, because she was probably wrapped up so far in grief that she couldn't see through the fog. And they searched for her all over Savannah. Now, the last place that had come to the mind of anybody was that house. They couldn't understand why she would want to return, but her husband said, you know what, I'm going to look at it anyways, because it's the last place. And what do they say? It's always the last place you look. So he enters the house, and he's checking each room. And so he's finding nothing, I'm sure breathing a sigh of relief, until he checks the last room, the baby's nursery. Now, his feet have become very heavy, but even as he slowed down, his heartbeat rapidly increased. Probably knowing that what he was going to find, because he was going to find something, he knew it in his gut, I think. He found what he feared, though. When he opened that door, his wife was hanging lifelessly from a rope wrapped around her snapped neck. He ran frantically to her aid, but he couldn't save her. All he could do is scream and curse the world. Now, to make this even a bit more eerie and add a little more depth to this particular room, some believe that the room that they found that young woman in, her baby's nursery, was actually the very same room that the doctor starved himself to death in. But, alas, there's no evidence that this ever happened. This is just another horrifying story that is 12 West Oglethorpe. The afterlife has still been, well, busy. And it seems that these dark stories didn't end when these people departed their earthly life. And so their ghosts have been said to stay. Some claim that they've seen the spirit of the doctor haunting this house, his ghostly shadow roaming the now abandoned property. Maybe this is the punishment he wanted. Maybe he wanted to be doomed to haunt the grounds where his family died for all eternity without them. Maybe he thinks this is what he deserves. Now, if you're walking by the house, a lot of people have said that they've seen paranormal happenings. You could see a shadowy image. It could be a fully formed apparition. And they look like normal people just enjoying the evening for a stroll. But if you dare to approach what you think is another person, they may just vanish right from your eyes. Now, neighbors of this abandoned house, which have made some rather interesting claims as well. So they think they've heard sounds of pots and pans. Maybe that doctor just gave it an 8, right? But maybe not, because you oftentimes will see a man crying out of pain. And that's an apparition. No matter what tale you believe, no matter what actually went on, there is a reason this house is so paranormally active. Could there have been a doctor who lived at that location? Maybe. We don't know the whole story. Now, the house is still rife with rumors, but maybe more of a more positive nature. Hopefully, this won't stay an abandoned, cursed playground for lost souls, but perhaps that is what we are looking for, to find that silver lining and getting out of all this fog. I did a bit more digging and tried to get a little bit more of actual history on this house. So, it is very popular, okay? But little really is known about it, especially of the prior residents. So, speculated that it is built in 1898 as a private home for Bernie Gordon, who was the brother of Juliet Gordon Lowe, who we know as the founder of Girl Scouts. Now, in 1908, they did sell it to the Elks Lodge 183, who was a community-oriented social group wherein neighbors came together and families shared meals and children grew up. So they sold it for $20,000 after Gordon died, according to elks.org. The Elks occupied the mansion before it was transformed into a performing arts school, which was eventually abandoned in 1985. Now, from about that time is when the various legends and tall tales came out, and it made it a central attraction for tour groups, especially for ghost tours. So they tell you the tale of the doctor who attempted to cure yellow fever. They tell you about the young couple, and they tell you probably about the Satanists. But, again, there's no evidence to support any of that. The building was abandoned for years. In 2009, however, some teenagers started a fire in a nearby dumpster. Well, the blaze broke out and lasted several hours before it was put out. There was no person injured, but the ballroom was completely burned and the walls and roof began to fold in on themselves. This mansion would not reopen its doors until January 5th of 2018, and that was after some heavy restoration effort, y'all. So eventually it did become home to Husk, which is a popular fine dining restaurant. Now, according to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, the rehabilitation included a new roof structure, reconstruction of the parterre, and the addition of a central skylight. All reconstructions and renovations were made while maintaining as many historic qualities as possible. Which makes sense. You're trying to keep it as authentic as possible, but you're also trying to glam it up a bit, I guess. So, this is one thing that I find interesting about this house, in that it does paint more of a picture to me that we were seeing prior to this. And on top of that, we find that the side porch was reopened with its original doorways, windows, and other elements repaired or replaced. Inside, multiple fireplaces were restored along with the historic grand staircase. The rehabilitation, it really truly restored this damaged. It brought ashes. It was like a phoenix. It took from the ashes and it now has transformed it into something ultimately beautiful and something thriving. And is now Husk. And just looking at some of the things, I looked at Zillow because I couldn't help myself, guys. So it says it's 10,694 square feet, which for a house, I'm all down. Like, let me go. And it's crazy because the lot is 5,400 square feet, which I don't know how much that really is. I'll be very honest with you, but it's beautiful. And it's gigantic, which would be perfect for a restaurant because you would need that space. But I digress. I just wanted y'all to have some more information on this house that we could find evidence on, and just to know too that Savannah is truly trying to maintain its history, and they're doing that in such wonderful ways. So thank you, Savannah, for keeping these places alive, because this gives us a point that we can go back to. Buttercups, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. And if you did, and you have comments or questions or even suggestions on what we should be talking about, which I would totally go for, you can email me at harktisthetebelle@gmail.com. You can find me on Spotify, YouTube, and the Facebook. All right. But I hope you guys have a spectacular week, and I can't wait to see you next week.